Okay, thank you very much, Karun. Is this on? Yeah, it's on. Thank you very much. So we're moving now to our second session, which is closely related to the first session, even in the fact that the artists themselves in question knew each other and were close friends. So our next speaker is Dr. Lucy Kent, to my right. Lucy has many talents. She's an excellent painter in her own right, and she studied a Bachelor of Fine Art at the prestigious Rhode Island School of Design. She then turned the corner from art into art history, and she did a master's at the Courtauld Institute with Lisa Tickner and a PhD at the University of Cambridge, focusing on the relationship between British modernism and new religious movements. So she actually was due to come here from Los Angeles, weren't you? But then she and her husband fell foul of Donald Trump's immigration policies, and so she's based in London at the moment instead. So Lucy is going to deliver a paper entitled Material Illusions, 3 Seminal British Modernists and Christian Science. So Lucy, over to you. Here is the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, James, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to thank you and Vid for organizing this wonderful event and the Foundation for having us here. It's by far the most beautiful conference location I've ever had the privilege of going to, so thank you so much. This paper was taken from my PhD research, as James just said. The fact that Ben Nicholson, his first wife Winifred Nicholson, and his second wife Barbara Hepworth were interested in Christian Science is often mentioned in the literature, but it's rarely treated as anything more than a biographical curiosity. The tendency has been to downplay its importance in their lives, and historians have been wary of drawing any direct parallels between the doctrine and the works themselves. There are many reasons for exercising caution when it comes to discussing the religious connotations of modern art, and by no means are these kinds of associations cut and dried. In the case of these 3 artists, however, there is an overwhelming amount of archival evidence in the form of books, letters, and personal notebooks that attest to the fact that Christian Science was a significant influence in each of their lives for almost the entirety of their careers. Furthermore, their writings make it clear that they each understood their creative output as an extension of their religious beliefs. Praise is the true name for art, wrote Winifred, and Barbara echoed, a sculpture should be an act of praise, an enduring expression of the divine spirit. Ben insisted on more than one occasion that painting and religion were the same thing. In the 30s, he complained to Winifred that Herbert Reed's assessment of his work lacked, quote, the very necessary Christian Science idea to clarify and give it substance. In the 40s, he told the critic Hartley Ramsden that the constructive movement he was promoting in England was, quote, closer to the true Christian Science idea than any other kind of art. And in the 60s, he reiterated his belief to Herbert Reed that painting and Christian Science were corresponding means of discovering an unseen spiritual reality. Winifred was first introduced to the faith by Paul Nash's wife, Margaret, during the early 1920s, and she remained a believer until her death in 1981. Ben, who had first learned of Christian Science during a trip to California in 1918, also became a committed believer during the mid-1920s. Letters in the Tate archive reveal that he continued to seek spiritual guidance from Christian Scientists until as late as 1975. Hepworth's parents became Christian Scientists during her early adolescence. Her own interest in the faith was then significantly deepened and consolidated through her relationship with Ben after 1931, and archival documents demonstrate that she was contacting Christian Science practitioners for spiritual guidance until at least 1969. This is not to suggest that Christian Science was the only influence, nor was it even the only spiritual influence that they engaged with. Hepworth had a wide range of religious, scientific, and philosophical interests, from psychoanalysis to Buddhism, and maintained ties with the Anglican Church alongside her Christian Science beliefs. Ben and Winifred's interests were similarly eclectic, but it's clear that Christian Science was the most formative and longest-lasting influence in each of their lives, as well as one that provided a philosophical point of contact between the 3 of them. In 1875, the founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, outlined her philosophy in a book called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Numerous well-worn and heavily annotated copies of the book that belong to Ben, Barbara, and Winifred, as well as notebooks filled with their extensive notes from it, can be found at the Tate Archive and at the Hepworth Wakefield. In her text, Eddy argues that there are two conceptions of reality. One, which is governed by what she calls mortal mind, and another, which adheres to the laws of immortal or divine mind, which is synonymous with God. Mortal mind, guided by the physical senses, creates a false, materialistic understanding of reality. Divine mind, guided by spiritual intuition, is the true and perfect nature of reality, the infinite and harmonious universal substance of which all things are a part. In Christian Science, all that is flawed or incongruent, such as sickness, disfigurement, and death, is understood as a misconception, an illusion of mortal mind. Acknowledging matter as a product of human error and considering the world as a spiritual whole brings the believer back into a natural state of health and harmony with the universe, governed by the eternal laws of divine mind. In Eddy's view, it was because Jesus understood that matter does not exist that he was able to transcend it, to rise from the dead and to heal the sick. These acts, she insisted, were not miracles, but simply revelations of divine truth. So Christian scientists take the concept of mind over matter to a new extreme, suggesting that matter doesn't even really exist. It's an illusion that can be manipulated or overcome by the correct way of thinking. It is for this reason that they view medicine as unnecessary. Disease is seen as a material concern that can be overcome by thought alone. Members of the faith tend to regularly consult Christian Science practitioners who are licensed by the Mother Church to practice spiritual healing and well-being techniques on behalf of their clients. Ben, Barbara, and Winifred consulted practitioners constantly for help with everything, from their marital woes and financial difficulties to broken bones and head colds. And here is an image of a practitioner at work on a patient that Eddy commissioned to illustrate one of her texts. And this is what it looks like when it works. And I believe this is a portrait of Eddy herself conducting a healing. While I won't have much time for in-depth analysis, I would like to discuss some of the ways in which the influence of Christian Science can be discerned in the symbolism, design, and function of the work that these artists produced while they were actively engaging with the faith. To begin with an example of symbolism, an understanding of Christian Science sheds light on Nicholson's use of the symbol of the crown during the early 1930s. His 1932 portrait of Hepworth, crowned head, the Queen, has often been interpreted as an emblem of his desire and admiration for her, as well as a nod to the Cubist theme of playing cards. However, I believe that this painting is also Nicholson's record of Hepworth's progressive enlightenment. During this period, her letters to Nicholson are filled with references to Christian Science, reports of her weekly meetings with their practitioner, Susan Foxton Ferguson, and accounts of the beautiful new world that is becoming ever more apparent to her through the lens of their faith. Her letters are stamped with the image of King George V inside profile. I believe that Nicholson was referencing this royal icon in his portrayal of Hepworth. Both images feature a crown hovering above the subject's head. The ruffled line Nicholson uses at the bottom of the crown seems to echo the ragged edge of the stamp, and the horizontal lines radiating from behind Hepworth's head are similar to the striations surrounding the king's profile. That Nicholson should make this visual analogy between Hepworth, who's undergoing this spiritual awakening, and the reigning King of England is in keeping with Christian Science rhetoric. Power, according to Mary Baker Eddy, cannot simply be endowed upon someone by lineage or decree, but is something generated from within through spiritual understanding. The official seal of Christian Science is the cross and the crown, and it's stamped on the cover of all the religion's literature, which Hepworth and Nicholson were regularly reading and quoting in their letters at this time. The cross represents the burden of overcoming the world of appearances through thought, and the crown is the reward for doing so, dominion over the kingdom of God that exists within us all. Eddy instructed her followers to, quote, "Take up the cross and bear it, for through it you win and wear the crown." And this correlation is illustrated beautifully in the similar image of Mary Baker Eddy, which appeared in a book on her teachings written in 1913 by one of her closest friends and followers, Augusta Stetson. And here the significance of the crown as a Christian Science symbol of spiritual enlightenment is made clear. There may also be a Christian Science basis for the strict geometrical idiom Ben employed in his later white reliefs. According to Eddy, the circle, having no beginning or end, represents spiritual or divine mind. The straight line symbolizes the materialistic mortal mind, which adheres to the limited world of appearances. It is clear that Nicholson absorbed this semiotic code, as several of his notebooks contain Eddy's dictum that, quote, divine mind is perpetual motion. Its symbol is the sphere. Eddy also explains the concept of Jesus Christ in relation to this duality, where the term Jesus represents the finite earthly body, and Christ refers to the eternal spiritual idea. Jesus, the body, was destroyed on the day of the crucifixion, according to Eddy, but Christ, the spiritual being, lives on eternally. Hepworth's decision to use a circle as an emblem of Christ in her 1966 construction crucifixion in this context can be seen as an expression of the undying spiritual concept of Christ, rather than the broken and bloodied material body of Jesus. Hepworth was battling cancer when she made this work and was consulting Christian Science practitioners alongside conventional medicine to aid her recovery. I wanted to go free and hang up a circle, she explained. It seems to upset people. I find it very serene and quiet. In keeping with this theme, I believe that Winifred Nicholson's late work, Consciousness, can also be interpreted as a representation of divine mind, symbolized by a sphere. For the most part, however, Winifred found that flowers and the brilliant light and color they seem to generate were the most appropriate vehicle for her personal spiritual outlook. I can't think of anyone who could be a circle, not even Mrs. Eddy, she wrote to Ben. But anyone can be a flower. It's easy, it grows and moves and enjoys being alive. For Winifred, flowers represented the secret of the cosmos. Endeavoring to paint not just portraits of flowers, but the light they convey, she marveled at their mysterious prism-like ability to turn light into rainbows, absorbing and reconfiguring the sun's rays into colors that glow with the same transcendent vibrancy of light itself. Light, in the view of Christian Science, is yet another synonym for divine mind. According to Eddy, light is a tangible symbol of life, truth, and love, and not a vitalizing property of matter. It is divine mind, Eddy insists, which, quote, paints the petal with myriad hues, glances in the warm sunbeam, arches the cloud with a bow of beauty, blazons the night with starry gems, and covers earth with loveliness. Winifred strove to capture what she called flower light in paint, arranging patterns of color in combinations that she hoped would radiate like a lamp. In her later work, Winifred used a scientific prism to study the full spectrum of color contained in light. In her writing, she pointed out that color, as an immaterial component of light, is not contained within the outlines of finite form, but moves and morphs throughout the world independently from matter. Sunlight, moonlight, candlelight, electric light all change the color of an object, she observed. So the local color of an object does not belong to the object. For Winifred, color represented a living energy in a state of perpetual motion and existing in a realm beyond the material. Like music or mathematics, color corresponded with an autonomous system of logic, independent from the physical world. That Winifred's theory of color was spiritually conceived is evident in her distinction between mortal and spiritual color in a letter she wrote to the Canadian physicist and biologist Glenn Schaefer in 1980. Mortal color is the photography color. Letterboxes are red, grass is green, but the spiritual, immortal part of color is the color of its inmost thought, the movement of those prismatic vibrations. A bad painter paints the color of the surface. A painter whose eyes see light paints the inside that is not exposed to the light of material seeing. Color and light were, for Winifred, a point of access to a broader spiritual unity. She explained to Schaefer, Holy Ghost, the Spirit, has no line. It comes from everywhere and goes to everywhere. No boundaries, no beginning, no end, no outlines. But color, oh yes, of course color, so that color can be the force called in. Love has no lines, owns everything, is everywhere, everywhere is color. All paradoxes can be surmounted by love, or shall we say color. So what I believe Winifred was trying to do in works like this one was to point to how color, as a component of light or divine mind, acted as a unifying force in the world. If one looked to color and how it moved and morphed independently from material bounds, one could get a sense of the spiritual unity of things beyond material appearances. This concept was really interesting to me because one of the paradoxes that I was contending with in my research was trying to understand how these artists, who genuinely believed that matter was an illusion that must be transcended, could reconcile this belief with their creation of material objects. Winifred found a solution to this dilemma by bringing color and light into her work, elements which she felt were aligned with a divine force that could not be restricted by material bounds. And I think that Hepworth began to do something similar in her approach to sculptural form during the 1930s. Just as Winifred used color to point to the spiritual unity of all things, Hepworth challenged the bounds of matter by piercing the form and sculpting not only with matter, but with light and space. If the pierced hole was conceived as an integral component of the work, then by logical extension, so too was the atmosphere surrounding the form. In this way, the sculptural idea could extend infinitely beyond its physical proportions. Vision is not sight, she wrote. It is the perception of the mind. It is the discernment of the reality of life, a piercing of the superficial surfaces of material existence that gives the work of art its own life and purpose and significant power. Winifred also began to experiment with the possibilities of abstract form during the 30s, developing a series of increasingly abstract images based on her 1922 painting, Cyclamen and Primula. This process reflects her desire to push through the veil of material appearances towards a kind of universal logic or spiritual harmony. And this focus on the abstract relationships between things, rather than the things themselves, was a central concern of hers even in her seemingly representational works. She explained to her son Jake, "I can find abstract space shapes in the relationship of cloud to flower pot or mountain peak to nearby shadow. When one does find it, it is the point where a painting touches spiritual reality, the fundamental essence of things beneath, behind, beyond, and before visual experience. You don't find spiritual reality in the visual appearance of things, which is always a surface appearance. If you can find the true juxtaposition or relationship of anything to anything else, it's there at once." While Winifred ventured into form, Barbara began to experiment with the sculptural potential of color in works such as this. Here, the saturated blue pigment applied within the carved recess creates a sense of depth that pushes beyond the physical dimensions of the object. Barbara later explained, "The color in the concavities plunged me into the depth of water, caves or shadows deeper than the carved concavities themselves." So Barbara, like Winifred, employed color as a means of transcending the physical limitations of the art object. As Ben once put it, color exists not as applied paint, but as the inner core of an idea, and this idea cannot be touched physically any more than one can touch the blue of a summer sky. Ben also strove to arrive at a point of balance between color and form, object and idea in his paintings. "From Winifred, I learned so much about color," he once told a friend, "and from Barbara a great deal about form." Drawing from their influence and the beliefs that they shared, Ben sought a point of harmony in his paintings that he explained was embedded as deeply in the material as in himself. To arrive at this point was to realize a part of spiritual reality. In 1964, he told Herbert Reed, "Perhaps the most vital point of all is that these discoveries, made by artists, Mondrian, for example, were always there, and we merely reveal them. This is the Christian Science attitude, that the reality is there and that we merely have to see it. In the end, this is the point, and where Christian Science and painting link up, I think. This is a fascinating comment because it demonstrates that Ben, who as a close friend of Mondrian's would have been well aware of his theosophical interests, still viewed Mondrian's work as an expression of his own Christian Science beliefs. For Ben, all great art was a direct expression of divine mind, whether the artist was aware of it or not. And Ben's explicit acknowledgement of the Christian Science basis of art in statements such as this can help us understand how and why these artists sincerely believed that art could function as a positive healing force in the world. The central premise of Christian Science is that when one understands reality as a single spiritual whole, all disease, conflict, and suffering disintegrate. The realization of divine mind, according to Eddy, not only restores the believer to an ideal state of health and happiness, but unifies men and nations, ends wars, annihilates whatever is wrong in social, civil, criminal, political, and religious codes, equalizes the sexes, and leaves nothing that can sin, suffer, be punished, or destroyed. The right way of thinking, essentially, could solve anything and everything if enough people practiced it. There is a sense of this kind of idealism in Ben, Winifred, and Barbara's writings that indicates that they believed that their work, in pointing to spiritual reality, could have a reparative effect on both the human body and on society as a whole. Winifred told her son Jake, who is also an artist and a Christian Scientist, quote, "We artists in vision, in beholding, have got important work to do. It is an imperative demand upon us that we heal our cities and our fellow people." Barbara told Herbert Reed that the aesthetic comprehension of fundamental rhythms in art could, quote, "aid the healing of wounds." She explained to J.P. Hoden that art could facilitate healing by demonstrating universal continuity to those who were blind to it. Our thoughts either lead us to life and continuity, she cautioned, or they may lead us the way of the biologist applying radiation on mice, the way to annihilation. That is why it is so important that we find our complete sense of continuity backwards and forwards in this new world of forms and values. The reparative function of art became a particularly urgent concern for these artists during the Second World War. Susan Foxton Ferguson, who served as Ben and Barbara's primary Christian Science practitioner from the early 30s until her death in 1961, wrote several letters to Ben after the outbreak of war, reminding him of the important work they had to do in maintaining sight of divine mind and in helping others to do the same. "Right knowing and nothing but right knowing can stop the carnage," she told him. "We have to overcome evil by our knowledge of true love and real life." In response to her instruction, Nicholson proudly sent her a copy of an essay he had just published on abstract art in the magazine Horizon that suggested that the liberation of form and color was closely linked with all the other liberations one hears about, and therefore should be listed among the nation's war aims. By freeing mortal minds from the bounds of material vision, abstract imagery, from a Christian Science perspective, could facilitate the resolution of all discord, including the war. Ben sent Ferguson his writings on art on several occasions and sent her invitations to his exhibitions. He actually sent her a signed edition of this lithograph shortly before Britain declared war in 1939. It's now in the possession of Ferguson's granddaughter here in Canada. Hepworth once said, quote, "When there has been a threat to life, like the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima or the menace of pollution, my reaction has been to swallow despair, to make something that rises up, something that will win." And I think this speaks to the approach all three of these artists took to their work. They refused to perpetuate negativity and sorrow, seeking instead to make beauty and harmony a kind of palpable presence, a reality in people's lives. And this, for me, is at the heart of why I think an understanding of Christian Science is so important to interpreting their work, because it really highlights this kind of wonderful idealism which might not otherwise come across in its entirety. This sense that art could literally change the very nature of existence, that it could act as a powerful, transformative force for good. For Ben, Barbara, and Winifred, art served a crucial divine purpose, leading minds away from mortal, material perception towards a higher spiritual truth. And it's important to bear in mind that for these three artists, Christian Science was far from an insular way of thinking or an idiosyncratic system of belief that was secretive or outlandish. Although Christian Science is not nearly as well known today, during the 1930s and throughout the Second World War, it was at the peak of its popularity in England. By 1941, England was home to no less than 148 churches and 139 societies dedicated to Eddy's teachings. Furthermore, Christian Science aligned with a wide range of other enormously popular new religious movements at the time, like theosophy, anthroposophy, and spiritualism. Several of the artists Ben, Winifred, and Barbara were closest with maintained similar anti-materialist worldviews. Mondrian's interest in theosophy led him to a corresponding utopian outlook. In a 1939 letter to Nicholson and Hepworth, he reminded them that, quote, "Art won't be necessary when life has grown to its full development." Naum Gabo divined his approach to constructivism in terms that aligned perfectly with Eddy's tenets. Constructive art, he contended, reinforced, quote, "the image of good, not of evil, the image of order, not of chaos, the image of life, not of death." In 1943, Hepworth recalled, "My work was construction long before I'd heard of Gabo, or met him, or heard of his early and very important contribution. That fact alone pulled us together when we met, naturally." Not only were Paul and Margaret Nash interested in Christian Science, but during my research I discovered that they shared the same Christian Science practitioner as Hepworth and Nicholson, Susan Foxton Ferguson. I managed to track down Foxton Ferguson's descendants, and in their library they found this biography of Nash that Margaret sent to Foxton Ferguson shortly after his death. The inscription reads, "To darling Fergie, who is Paul's best friend." There is more work to be done on the extent to which Nash's interest in Christian Science fed into his imagery, but I feel sure that, at the very least, it must have colored his belief in the remedial effects of art. Like Ben and Barbara and Winifred, Nash believed that art could align the mind with a higher reality, and that focusing on this transcendent spiritual world could heal the body. During the Second World War, he taught wounded soldiers how to paint and draw at a hospital for head injuries near his home in Oxford, believing that the act of creation would speed their recovery. Beyond gelling with the widespread interest in new religious movements amongst avant-garde circles, Christian Science beliefs corresponded with the prevailing aesthetic theories in England at the time. Ben, Barbara, and Winifred all studied the writings of the famous Bloomsbury aesthetes Roger Fry and Clive Bell, whose theory of significant form suggested that certain formal arrangements could serve as a kind of portal to a spiritual realm beyond the visible world. Both critics made repeated claims for the artist as a kind of mystic who could access this spiritual reality and make it visible to others through their work. It is little wonder that some of their most adamant supporters, such as the art educator Marion Richardson and the critics Margaret Booley and Charles Lewis Hind, were also Christian Scientists. So far from cutting Ben, Barbara, and Winifred off from the main currents of artistic thought, Christian Science broadened their outlook. It allowed them to band together with artists on the continent and cultivate a sense of camaraderie that would otherwise have been impossible. Take, for example, Gabo's brother, Antoine Pevsner, who wrote to Nicholson, "Nothing can resist our collective action, a function and a fight for the same effort." Or Kandinsky, another theosophist, who told him, "All of us who want to show the art of the new possibilities, new paths, are warriors unintentionally. Fortunately, we can fire our cannons from our studios." All of which is to say that a great many abstract artists in Europe, coming from a wide range of religious perspectives, saw themselves as a united front, spiritual warriors in the crusade against materialism. Not only did they find many like-minded friends and colleagues, but the philosophical breadth of Christian Science allowed them to draw parallels across a wide range of intellectual disciplines that provided constant fodder for their work. Ben and Winifred, for example, were interested in the writings of the renowned physicist Arthur Eddington, who contended that, quote, "For all we know, matter may itself be mental." Barbara looked to mathematical models for inspiration. Mathematical entities, she argued, were the perfect expression of divine mind. These seemingly disparate intellectual pursuits were bound up with their desire to solve the grand equation of existence, a task their faith deemed entirely possible. As Barbara wrote to Winifred in 1936, Mrs. Eddy says the rule, divine principle, is already established, and it is our task to work out the solution. We can do this, I know. We can in our work, and we can in our lives. Resolving this existential equation was an ambition that sustained each of them and their art for the rest of their lives. I've only been able to express the very simplest first letters of the alphabet of spirit, Winifred admitted in old age. But I've done enough to know that it's there, just beyond the realm of our consciousness. And I always know that some of us, some humans, will reach it, like the first person to fly the Atlantic. After that, all can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for that wonderful paper and so much to compare with the paper before it. Does anyone want to kick off with some questions? Sorry, this wire, I'm struggling with the wire. Does anyone want to start with any questions? Okay. Yeah. David.
I found it interesting that both in... Thank you, by the way, very much. That was fascinating, and I agree that there's a lot of points of potential comparison. But I'm going to ask about your footnote as well as the footnote in the article. I'm very, very curious about this correspondence with Herbert Reed. And I don't know if you went down that so-called rabbit hole at all in your research. Do you know anything about how Herbert Reed sort of reacted to Ben Nicholson's likening of Christian Science to... I mean, Herbert Reed, art was emancipatory, obviously, to hell with culture. Just art. How did Herbert Reed react to any of that? Did you get any of the responses that might have come back from him?
I did not find a response to that specific letter, but I did get the sense, I do think that Herbert Reed was much more open to religion than has been acknowledged in most of the literature. He's sort of cast usually as this dyed-in-the-wool atheist, and really he had a wide range of religious interests. He was making theosophical thought forms during the First World War, having come into contact with theosophy at Leeds. He was going to lectures by Uspensky in London. His first novel, The Green Child, has sort of mystical elements. He never really sort of settled on a specific doctrine, and he never really bought into any specific doctrine. At the end of his life, he commented on the fact that all of the work he collected had this sort of spiritual impetus, and that was the work he was most drawn to. But he said, in that sort of interstitial space, waiting on God, I shall live and shall probably die. But even then, he was referencing Waiting on God by Simone Weil, who is a mystic in her own right. So I don't think he ever bought into a specific line of thought, but he was certainly much more sympathetic to those ideas than I previously imagined before I started doing this research.
Thank you. That is really interesting. That's new knowledge to me, most certainly.
Anyone else want to ask a question? Any of the students? Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you for such a nice presentation. A few years ago, I was watching a documentary by Jim Alcalini about science and other subjects. And that probed a question that science itself is an intellectual activity. Then when people ask questions and apply logic and with reasoning, we try to find out something. And he questions that, can we name science as Christian science or Islamic science or this science or that science? So he was a little uncomfortable about adding adjectives to sciences. So that's first part of my question. The second part of my question is related to it, but you talked about the circle which has no ending point and no starting point, which describes or represents God mind. And then you also talk about the color, which is God's spirit. So I'm wondering, where is divine's body, or how in the artwork they represent the divine body? Because body, mind, and spirit, they are all three aspects which are always connected or interconnected with each other. And how this mind, spirit, and body, and then makes a relation with the Christian science which I'm questioning. Do we really need to attach this adjective to science, or can we go beyond it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy chose to call it science because she was trying to sort of promote this new worldview that was the new science, and she was drawing on a lot of contemporary findings. She was talking about Darwin in her doctrine. She was trying to come up with a sort of post-Enlightenment philosophy that would encompass science, but one detractor of Christian Science at the time said that Christian Science was kind of like grape nuts, like neither Christianity or science. So, I mean, obviously it's controversial that you could use the term science. But, I mean, really she's promoting this idea that it was the root of all truth, scientific, religious, and otherwise. And that all of these things, there was sort of like a confluence of ideas that she was trying to promote. Your question about the spiritual body, the idea of Christian Science is that the body doesn't actually physically exist, that is sort of a fallacy. And so that Trinity doesn't really exist in Christian Science. It's more of a duality. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Following up on that, you talk about the relationship between aesthetic and spirituality. So if you can elaborate more on it, the relation between aesthetics and the spiritual mind, as you just spoke about it in your presentation.
Do you mean the Roger Fry and Clive Bell?
The divine mind?
Oh, yeah.
In relation to aesthetics and the
yes. So, yeah, actually, really interestingly, Mary Baker Eddy references artists quite a lot in her doctrine, too. And she seems to make a case for abstract art, even though the work that she herself commissioned wasn't abstract, which I think sort of relates to what you were saying about Mondrian initially, using representational works because people weren't ready to understand this sort of abstract perspective right away. And that was her theory as well. But there are two really interesting passages in Science and Health where she references artists directly, one of which she talks about two artists in relation to a Christian Science believer and a non-believer. And the Christian Scientist artist says, I look to transcendental ideals. I don't look to matter for my model because I know that matter is a lie. And the non-Christian Scientist artist says, I can't give up these sort of romantic notions of this material life because they're too meaningful to me, and to do so would require too much self-abnegation. And so she's sort of telling her followers to look at the world through that lens. And it seems like she's sort of making this case for abstract art, which is extraordinary in 1875, really. And then in another one, she talks about us all as sculptors and how we're all chiseling thought every day in our lives, and that we must decide what model we're going to look to. Are we going to look to the matter model, or are we going to look to the model of spirit, which is more of this sort of like Platonic ideal, as far as I can tell.
Any other questions from the students? I mean, I've got one very brief question and then one question to both of you. The first question is, one of your stars is Herbert Reed, and the Herbert Reed archive is at the University of Victoria. Does anyone know, do you know why that archive ended up at UVic? What the connection was?
Alan is the connection.
Well, I inherited something.
And Matthew, sorry, what was your proselyte?
Well, you're referring to Matthew Adams, who's on a Banting postdoctoral fellowship to work with the Herbert Reed papers. But the connection with the University of Victoria goes back to someone who was in the writing department who knew Herbert Reed towards the end of Herbert Reed's life. But Herbert Reed also has a connection to Victoria through George Woodcock, because George Woodcock came to Canada in the late 1940s, and he settled in Souk, which is a village not far from Victoria. So this part of the world was on Herbert Reed's mind through that connection, and they carried on an extensive correspondence. And coincidentally, a number of years ago, since in my capacity as the director of the Anarchist Archive, I acquired a Souk libertarian library with all this rare material from the World War II period, and I've often wondered, did it belong to George Woodcock originally, or there was also an anarchist who was a conscientious objector who induced George Woodcock to come to Souk. So anyway, and it might have been his collection, but that's a roundabout way of saying the connection with the University of Victoria and Herbert Reed has, I think, two prongs. First, George Woodcock, and secondly, this literary figure whose name escapes me at the moment. I'm sorry, but he knew Herbert Reed personally and went over and talked with him about where his papers were going to go, and thank goodness they came to Victoria. It's a real wonderful thing to have.
Thank you very much. Well, the second question. You should go first. Yeah.
Thank you. I so enjoyed your paper too.
Thank you.
One of the
Don't
things
forget your
that
mic.
is common to both. Oh, sorry. One of the things that's common to both papers that I find intriguing, inspiring, is the sense of mission that these painters not only had, but kept up through their lives, through some of the most traumatic events, of the last 100 years. And so the question I have out of that, it's specifically with respect to Christian Science, does it embody a sense of mission and any sense that you have to persevere over and beyond both the tragedy of personhood and the tragedy of the world?
Yes, absolutely. Mary Baker Eddy actually talked about war as the material world sort of self-destructing, so it was something that you had to endure in order to get to the next sort of stage of enlightenment. And the Christian Scientists in times of war were just supposed to sort of carry the torch and be kind of unflappable, and other people were supposed to follow their lead. Of course, in practice, that's not it's not that easy to do. So I know that Hepworth in particular struggled a lot during the Second World War when the practicalities of sort of motherhood and dealing with all this destruction on a daily basis, this onslaught of sort of material destruction, was a lot for her to bear, and her faith certainly wavered. And the Christian Science terminology sort of fades out a bit, and her interests broaden a great deal during the Second World War, and she becomes more interested in psychoanalysis, and her work takes a turn for the organic, and she decides that she needs to find some sort of balance between these sort of Platonic ideals and then these organic forms, and create a bridge for people that they can sort of see how one thing leads to another, as opposed to sort of escaping into this ivory tower of idealism. But what was interesting about Hepworth and Nicholson is that they continued to pay their Christian Science practitioners, Susan Foxton and Ferguson, throughout the war when they were in really dire straits financially. So that must have been quite a financial burden when they were really just scraping things together to feed their families and to survive. So yeah, I mean, I think their faith was tested, but they continued to be interested in Christian Science after the war. So yeah, they persevered.
Vid.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a great paper. So one thing that always struck me, I don't know, it's not just my own thought, that a lot of the new sects and religions of the 20th century represent a kind of a turn away from metaphor towards a kind of literalism. So, actually healing the sick, for example, in Christian Science, or in various forms of New Age spirituality, kind of, actually achieving transcendence in the here and the now, right? And that, of course, leaves many of us a bit uncomfortable, because it is a kind of a, return from a sort of, say, like a kind of a mature or, postmodern sensibility to a very kind of a literal belief. So I was wondering to what extent, if one is a bit uncomfortable with the more kind of sect-like aspect of these new forms of spirituality, should that lead one to revise one's opinion of these artists, or and to what extent are they really kind of believing in healing the sick here and now in this like very, very literal way? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously my reading is a very literal one, but for me that just makes so much more sense in terms of all these sort of like warring abstract factions or modern art factions, and how sort of caught up they were in these manifestos, and why they were so passionate about these ideas. And when you have this sort of religious basis, or this very literal idea that they were actually creating a new world, that they were all sort of fighting for this utopian reality, then it sort of makes more sense that there would be this sort of passion behind these ideas than if it was just a bunch of bravado and egos. So for me, it sort of clarified that era a little bit.
I mean, both of these papers have reminded me of a lot of Jeffrey in some ways, and I know that Jeffrey wouldn't have been interested particularly in Christian Science or Theosophy, but there is something that he was also in many ways trying to transcend matter, to use abstract form to move from the material to the immaterial, and he also, I think, believed passionately in the importance of the art and art disclosing some kind of truth. But the question I had, and it's for both of you really, is why do you think these new religious movements were so fashionable at that particular time? What was going on, in the water supply that got people really interested in these things back then?
I think the world was just changing at such a rapid pace then, and everything was in a kind of state of flux. And I think the idea of reality was very uncertain at the time, and this idea of being self-empowered also was very appealing in this time of uncertainty, that you somehow had control over the conditions of your existence, as opposed to being sort of at the mercy of a mercurial god. And also the fact that it sort of unified all these different ideas that were disparate and sort of disconcerting to people to have to contend with, that there was this notion that it's all still fine, we can still reconcile all these ideas in one neat package and have some definitive answer. I think that was appealing.
Do you have any thoughts, Lika, about why this was so fashionable then?
I don't really have anything to add what you just said. I think as far as Mondrian is concerned, and his contemporaries at least, it's, in addition to what you said on a more sort of abstract level, it also has to do, I think, with breaking away from, previous generations, be it artists before you, but also your parents. So in Mondrian's case, that was definitely the case, and he never really was very negative about the faith of his parents, but he wanted to explore other realms. So I think that's in it as well. What you see in the artistic practices also relates to the interest in spirituality, at least, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, we have Karun and anyone, and then Nikki after Karun, and then Lucy. Okay, so we'll go for Karun, Nikki, and then Lucy.
Thank you so much. I very much enjoyed that. I was madly typing some things, and we'll come back to some of the images myself later. One of the things I wanted to suggest for both presentations is the concept of maturity, which is sort of underlying some of the projects. Both of those projects, actually, sort of seem to imply that the artist is on a trajectory, perhaps further along on that trajectory of maturity in their spirituality, and that perhaps in the case of Piet Mondrian, realizing that he was addressing a point in the general evolution of maturity that wasn't quite there yet. And so I think that, to me, really helps to understand, what the place of the artist is. And in that previous conversation, I sort of proposed that maybe there's an alternative institution being developed, and so this challenge against the institutionalization of spirituality is sort of disingenuous. But I'm revising that, thinking that perhaps it's just points out there, more of greater maturity and suitable to artists and other seekers. So you have sort of points of light that might be of interest to the individuals, the specialists, those who are seeking, but may not be of interest to most other people, but are nonetheless very important. So I think that's worth noting. I also think that we should take a look at this. We've mentioned Plato so many times, this idea of essentialism, the identity between spirit and essence. I don't think you need to look at spirituality in only the sense of it's an essential, what's essential. But I do think it's important to look at this notion of universal truth and the concept of the enduring. What's enduring and what's sort of ephemeral. And seems to be a sense of the striving to try and find some sort of, I hate to use the word universal truth. I'd rather use sort of enduring meaning or something that's somewhat more enduring than the matter mind, the mortal mind that decays. So I like to introduce that concept because I think when you're a mortal person, let's talk about the embodied experience of consciousness. You want to look for something that's enduring beyond you. It helps to structure the meaning of what the hell you're doing it for. So I think that it seems to me that might have been a motivator. But I mean, whether you then dress it up as Christian Science or whatever else, whatever other New Age, non-New Age, Old Age, whatever philosophy you dress it up as. And the third thing I think I'd like to just add as another concept is this idea of linked to essentialism. Is this idea that the metaphysical is somehow higher than or better than or something worth striving for more than the material. And I think that one of the things that I remember this conversation with Jeffrey very clearly, like sort of taking you through the physical to the metaphysical, but there was always this really important attention to the physical realities, the social realities of the material, the physical realities of actually making work, and the actual logistics involved in it, but also the logistics of life. And so art not only exists in this metaphysical way in our minds, and it also really exists in the world, and it really functions in the world, and it addresses the material. So there was this interesting kind of he definitely saw you going through the material. I think James was right. You go kind of through the material to the physical to the metaphysical. But there wasn't, to me, this renunciation of the physical. In fact, there was a really intense celebration, as I've taken you on most of you on a tour, really sort of intense celebration of natural history and sort of a reattachment almost to that. Now, you may want to see that as essentializing too, but I think that offers an alternative path to the sort of essentializing view. I think that's one part of the spiritual path, but that I think that it needs to at some point loop back to then say, well, what's embodied consciousness, and how does that just denying mortal mind or just denying material mind may not be the full picture. It may not work in practice actually at all. Now I know I'm arguing with people who are probably not around to argue back with me, but I just wanted to offer that those two approaches are very much in the line of that essentializing approach to spirituality, and there is an alternative approach that I've pointed out on tour.
Okay, and Nikki, do you want to?
Yeah, my question was very specific to Lucy. I couldn't help but wonder about Hepworth's surgical drawings series and the relationship between these beliefs, Christian Science beliefs and interests, and that series. Because as far as I remember at the Hepworth Wakefield exhibition a couple of years ago, these beliefs weren't mentioned. Yeah. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. Hepworth was really interested in healing of a wide variety of methods of healing, and interestingly, Mary Baker Eddy doesn't actually condemn going to a surgeon, because she says in Science and Health, maybe it's best to leave serious injuries to the fingers of a surgeon at this point. And so that's not actually off limits, although when they sent their children to surgeons, they would write to Susan Foxton Ferguson, who would then have to comfort them and say, "Don't worry, this isn't actually going against your ideals." And but the surgical drawings are really interesting, because Hepworth apparently refused to see anything but reconstructive surgery, because the idea was you're bringing the body back to its ideal state, as opposed to taking anything away from it. And if you look at them, there's a lot of intense focus on the hands and the eyes and this sort of like collective energy. And I think what she was trying to picture is this sort of mental collective force of everyone coming together and bearing in mind like the restoration of health of the patient. And Eddy also had very specific instructions to the surgeon that they must at all times maintain this ideal vision of the healthy patient while they're working, and never allow any sort of negative thoughts to enter their mind, because that would then play out. And so, yeah, I think she was the sculpture paintings are. Sorry, the surgical paintings are a sort of testament to her appreciation of their work. Particularly, her daughter, Sarah, was in the hospital for a really long time because she had osteomyelitis, a bone infection. And she became very close with Norman Capner, one of her surgeons, and that's how she got into the operating theater in the first place. But she just developed very close relationships with these doctors, who were in turn very interested in her spiritual ideas and in her work, and she was very open about that. And Norman Capner actually took up sculpting himself. And they had lots of sort of metaphysical discussions, and yeah.
Okay, we'll take one brief question from Lucy and a brief answer from Lucy.
Right, I shall. Is this on? Yes. I'll try and make it brief. You've touched on this a little bit already, the idea that as part of this Christian Science, and I think this was going on in other kinds of similar movements at the time, is an idea that you mustn't be negative about anything. Because, of course, if it is all mind rather than matter, then if you are negative, or if you allow negative things into your life, then you're only going to create negativity. And this interests me because I think it's something that actually has continued, and we still see a legacy today in ideas like this incredibly popular book, is it called The Moment or The Secret or something?
Yeah.
So it interests me because it comes into the lives we live today, because there are many people who still live their lives by this principle. And so, I mean, clearly you see this is relevant. And so I could ask an open question about this, but it will take too long to answer. So instead I'm going to go for my one more yes-no answer, but slightly wacky, reaching too far question, which is, do you think this plays into how they see the term constructivism? In the sense that it's constructive.
Yeah.
It's not allowed to be destructive. It's always got to be positive. Positivity,
Yes.
positivity.
Yeah. And
thanks.
but they were very aware of that when they decided to sort of adopt the term constructivist in the 30s. But a really interesting thing is that when they became aware of constructivism, or around that time, they hadn't yet met Gabo, but I think they must have gotten wind of constructivism, because in around 1933 they start referring to Christian Science practitioners and Christian Science ideas as constructive thoughts and constructive people. And the word constructive doesn't appear one time in any of Eddy's writings. And so it seems that there's some sort of conflation of these ideals. And later on, they sort of break away from constructivism because they maintain that it was actually this Russian movement that they didn't really understand fully, and that they were doing their own thing that was their idea of constructivism and quite separate all along. But I think at that time, when everybody was sort of banded together and working towards similar goals, there was that sort of marriage of ideas, and yeah, that definitely played a role, the term constructive.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy.